Okay, so we're talking about study tips and tricks. We got the first midterm back. For some of us, it didn't go so hot. And the question becomes, what do we do about that? First thing, yes, it's totally possible to pass the class still. Right? When we look at the grade distribution of like how many points have been assigned, how many have not, mastery questions are 5% of your grade. There are 2 a week, right? You've probably been doing fine on mastery questions, but a small part of your grade anyway. The lab is 20% of your grade. That's kind of a big chunk. Quizzes, 15% of your grade. Right? And so when we think about, well, how much of the mastery questions have we done? How much of the lab have we done? How many quizzes have we done? Versus how much we have left? We've only just done 3 out of 7 of the quizzes, right? So we still have 4 more quizzes. So we haven't even done half the quizzes yet. And the lowest, I only take the top 6 scores. Different than dropping the lowest, kind of the same. For the labs, we've done 2, kind of 3 at this point. I don't think the third one's in your grade yet, but we've done 3, and we still have 5 more. So we've only done 3 out of 8 of our labs. The mastery questions, we've done a lot. We've probably, in your grade right now, we've probably got 8 mastery questions, but we still have 12 more to put into your grade, so that's 8 out of 20, right? So in these chunks, we haven't even done half of the points yet. And then that's not even the biggest part. So if we look at exam 1, that's the one we just did, that's 15%. That's the only one we've done. You look at exam 2, that's 20%. And then exam 3, I can't remember how I broke this up now. Let's see, that's 30, 40, 25. Right? So when you look at this chunk here, like we've done less than half of our exam points. So definitely still possible to pass. We have to do much better on the next 2 exams, and we have to make sure we get as many of these points as possible. Because we don't just want to pass, we want to get Bs, we want to get C pluses, we want to get As if we can. You can technically, even if you have perfect scores on everything else, and you don't take this exam, you can probably still get close to an A minus. Right? So like this one exam, like don't let it stress you out too much. And this is true in most of your classes. Depending on how your different classes have their grade distributions, by week 5, you still haven't decided even half of your grade yet. So lots of opportunities. And then of course the big question becomes, well, how can I make sure that instead of getting 30%, which we had a lot of people get in the 30% range on this, no offense to all of you, but it's the worst I've seen in like 8 years.
Yeah. It's brutal.
Yeah, it's like there's a lot of weird stuff about this quarter, about where we are in terms of time frame, with still dealing with some of the pandemic educational lag. Then we also had like that extra day off at the beginning of the quarter. Then we had the strike. There was a lot of weird things going on. Absenteeism has been way higher in my classes than usual. Phone distractions are way higher. There's a lot of stress in like the social, political world. Like when you look, like I listen to the news way too much. Like there's a lot of like I enjoy coming to class because I can't look at the news for 6 hours, and I'm just like, thank goodness, because something is going to go wrong. There's a lot of stuff going on in the world that makes it hard to focus. So it's not like you can't learn. It's not like you're all like not smart. Like you got into Cal Poly, you're good. Like getting into Cal Poly is difficult. The question becomes, what do we change in order to meet the challenges that Cal Poly is providing us? Because Cal Poly, it's hard to get into Cal Poly. It's also hard to graduate from Cal Poly. It's part of the reason that education from Cal Poly is so valuable, is because if you can make it through Cal Poly, you know how to do stuff, which means it's a lot of work. So what do we have to change in order to make sure we do well in that other part? And I'm gonna throw this back to an important idea that everyone I've talked to this week hasn't heard of, called Bloom's taxonomy. Have heard of this?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So this is essentially and there's some other layers. These are the ones we're going to focus on, because in your first year or two of Cal Poly, this is where we're focusing, and I got my understand and analyze in the wrong order. Right? And this is why we can have the average GPA. You don't have to tell me your GPA from high school, but GPA from high school, pretty high, right? The average GPA, the average high school GPA of incoming freshmen to Cal Poly from last year and this year was like 4.2, 4.25, which when I went to high school 85 years ago was not even possible. I'm older than I look. It wasn't even possible. 4.0 was the highest. But with the way that they changed AP credits and the way that they changed honors credits, you can now get GPAs above 4.0 and even above 4.5 now. Like, it's actually possible to get a 5.0 GPA in high school. It's crazy to me. But so our average high school GPA of incoming freshmen is like a 4.25, 4.28. Average end of first year GPA at Cal Poly, 2.8. Did y'all get really stupid in a year? No. But what we are going for at Cal Poly, what we're going for in college, is really different than high school, right? High school is all about this remember stage. So if you can memorize enough stuff, if you can get enough flashcards and flash through the cards and remember all of the different things, you're good. High GPA, you do great. Cal Poly, we're really looking at the understand and analyze levels, where you've got to remember a bunch of stuff to do that, but you also need to understand how those things you're remembering relate to each other and can point to new ideas. So the understand is not just remembering all the things, but being able to look at how the things you're remembering relate to each other and kind of describe a bigger system. The analyze is being able to look at that bigger system that you can understand and see how it relates to something else you haven't looked at yet. We don't get too much into the analyze in general chemistry. I mean, by the last quarter, if you take Chem 129 or Chem 126, the third quarter of general chemistry, we get much more into the analyze. This quarter, we're really doing remember, understand, very little bit of analyze. But because we are looking for really different kind of cognitive mental abilities than we were in high school, the way we study, the way we approach problem solving, the way we look at how we spend our time getting ready for things needs to be different. And that's this exam, this first exam is sometimes a big wake-up call for people that like, oh, I've been studying like I'm in high school still. I've been just trying to memorize a bunch of stuff and just kind of doing the same 10 problems over and over again because that worked for me in high school. And it's like, yeah, no, we're doing higher level thinking things now. So what are some tips and tricks? I probably shouldn't have erased that yet. First thing is the remembering, right? So we still have to work on that. We can't just ignore that, but that's something that can't be our only focus. And one of the things I was talking with people about yesterday was the way that reading the textbook, coming to office hours, doing the homework all kind of relate to each other. And then how all of that stuff can help us when we come to class and attending class. So 1 through 5 using the textbook, super honest, right? Like, I'm not going to judge you, I just need to know. So we've got a 2, a 3, a couple 3s, and a 4. So varying amounts of using the textbook. How are you using the textbook? Right? If you're just reading the textbook like a novel, it's not the best use of the textbook. right? Looking at the textbook like a novel is not the best use of the textbook. I suggest using the textbook in kind of a 4-step approach. Now, our textbook that we use has a really nice section at the end of each chapter that's key terms and equations. And you can always start with the key terms and equations. I've stressed key terms and equations. This is the remember stuff. So we have to start there. We have to have that base level of remembering things. Then, before I read the entire chapter, I go for the chapter summaries. Right? And the reason I start with the section summary instead of the chapter is, and this is my recommendation. You might find you read the textbook differently and it works for you. I find if I tried to read the textbook from like beginning of chapter to end of chapter, I fall asleep 2 paragraphs in, even though I love chemistry. I mean, this textbook's not as bad as some of the other ones I've used, but still, textbooks are not written to be like an adventure where you're like, oh, I gotta know what happens next. And the bigger problem I had, so that was one problem with reading textbooks. The other problem with reading textbooks, at least that I had when I was studying near seeds, was as I read the textbook, I couldn't tell what was interesting information that they thought would be fun for me to know versus what was the essential piece of like the lesson they were trying to get me to learn. And so if you start with the section summary, they take that like 6-page section and they turn it into a paragraph. So this is only going to be like, these are the things, like this paragraph needs to make sense to you like completely, where every word like you read is like, yes, I understand that. I can see how it relates to other things. I see how it explains other sections of this chapter, other sections of the book. It all makes sense to me. If you don't have that feeling when you read the section summary, then you can go back and start reading the text. So after you look at the section summary, there's 2 different ways you could go. That's not how you spell problems. So another nice thing about the textbook is after you read that section summary, you can go on and start doing some of the problems in the textbook, some of the problems in the mastery questions, some of the problems like in that section if you want to see the nice walkthroughs. And you can use that as a reflection of like, can I do all of these problems? Can I do some of these problems? Like the textbook thinks I should be able to do all of these problems by the time I finish reading this chapter. Do I actually have to read the whole chapter to do these problems? How much am I getting? Like what percentage of the problems do I look at? And I'm like, I don't even know what they're asking. What percentage of the problems am I looking at? And I'm like, okay, I can understand what they're talking about and I can do it. If you read the section summary and you're like, whoa, that doesn't make any sense, then you might want to come and read that section. Then hop over to problems. Now, the thing is, the idea here is you can do 1 and 2 in a very short amount of time, right? The thing that we want to look at is, since reading textbooks is difficult, it's not easy. If reading textbooks was easy, universities wouldn't exist anymore. You'd all just buy the text, or like there would be this thing where it's like, buy this textbook, read it, take this test, and now you've got a degree. You wouldn't have to pay nearly as much. It doesn't work that way, right? I don't know how many of you have tried reading textbooks on your own and been like, that'll get me everything I need. It's just, it's more difficult than that. So what we want to do is we want to find what's the best cost-benefit analysis. How much time do I put in for how much value am I getting out? Reading the entire section is a lot of time, and the amount of value versus just doing the key terms of equations and section summary, you can do this in a lot less time, so you have to get a lot more value for that amount of time you're putting in. So the idea is you got 10 minutes to study. You've only got 15 minutes to study. You can look through all the key terms and section summaries in about 15, 20 minutes. So you can get a lot of value in a really short amount of time. it's not everything, right? You still want to do those other parts, but every time you're going and studying something, you want to have this kind of reflective thinking. You don't want to just be like, well, I've got this list of stuff I have to do, and I'm going to do that list, and that's what I do every time because that's what I've in the past. You want to be really reflective of like, is the way I'm spending my time actually useful to me? How else could I spend my time, and would that be more useful? Can I have a balance of many different approaches that makes it so it's going overall better and I'm getting the most out of each way I'm using my time? And that kind of reflective thinking is not something that you necessarily have to do in high school, that you might not have had to do last quarter even. But as you get into your upper division classes, as you get into your junior and senior year, this type of like what actually works for me in studying becomes more and more important. And again, this is what works for me. You might find that like you try this and you're like, nope, I read the entire chapter every time and that's what works for me. And that's important reflective information to have. Come in, grab some chairs. We're talking study tips and tricks for a little bit. Okay, so that's one thing where we want to do that kind of cost-benefit analysis. This number one, now this how we use the textbook also starts to become really important with how do we spend our time in class. And this was something I had a meeting with a bunch of students yesterday, like 4 or 5 students yesterday, and one of the things they talked about was their difficulty focusing on the understanding step during class because they were working too much on the remember step. They were writing down definitions. They were writing everything down on the slides. I was flipping off the slides too fast because I was trying to get to things connecting, and they were like, I don't even remember those things yet. And so doing the key terms summaries, doing the key terms equations and summaries before you come to class is really important, right? If the first time, and we ran into this last class when I was talking about, was that last class? Did we just do functional groups on Thursday? Yeah. Okay, so in our last class, we had a ton of new vocabulary. We had a lot of new vocabulary. We did our functional groups, we did our geometries, it was the electronic geometry, molecular geometry, trigonal planar, bipyramidal, like all of those things, right? There was a lot of vocabulary, and if your focus was on just learning all of the vocabulary and trying to remember all the terms, that takes up all the energy you could have in doing the understanding part. So looking at the keys, so before class tonight, we all have class either at 3 or 6, we have class tonight. Take 5 minutes, take 10 minutes, go to the intermolecular forces section, I think it's 10.1 or 10.2, read the key terms, read the section summary. So that way when you come to class, when I say something, you're like, oh, I remember that word a little bit. I don't need to stress about writing it down. Look at that. The PowerPoint slides are already posted. Take, if you've got more than 10 minutes, if you got 20 minutes, flip through the PowerPoint slides. Download the PDFs. So that way you're like, oh, that's on the slide. I don't need to write all that down. I can look at that later. I need to write down the important kind of connection between the different ideas, that understanding step. You got to remember things. But during class, I try to push that understanding aspect during class. So I jump through key terms and concepts pretty quick to try and show you how the different key terms start to connect to each other. And if you're still writing down the previous definition when I'm trying to tell you how these 3 different definitions are related to each other, like you're missing the understanding part. And that's harder to get from the textbook unless you are reading the entire section carefully. So it's a lot bigger time cost. So prepping for class, that's another thing. Going back over old things. So now let's talk about how we use the different parts of things we've been doing in class. How did quiz 3 go for everybody? 1 through 5. The points are available now. I just released the feedback. I think it was out of 6 points, 1 through 6. Do you know how many points you got? You can show me with fingers.
Like
4 is 2. Oh, okay.
Yeah, terrible.
Right, so let's talk about what that quiz and what all the quizzes are doing and what this exam that really frazzled a lot of people and freaked a lot of people out. Let's talk about, I'll say the same thing I said to, I had a class of graduating seniors last quarter, and their first exam went really poorly. It was very hard material, but their exam went really poorly. And as I was handing it out, I was like, you're not done with your exam yet. Like if you picked up your exam, like after you take the exam, after the exam is graded, you're not done with the exam yet. You need to have, and you're not done with your quizzes yet. You're not done with quiz 1 yet, unless you've gone back and reviewed it, figured out what you've done right, what you've done wrong, right? So, right? So you want to use exams, quizzes, homeworks, anytime you're doing something where you don't know if you're doing it right or wrong and you get told later, you want to use that as a reflective tool. I don't know if you noticed on quiz 3, there was stuff from quiz 1 on it. There was stuff from quiz 2 on it. There was stuff from the midterm on it. So if you got, like, I don't know if I should call this one out right now. Which one was it? Number of photons. The number of photons problem is, at its core, multiply two numbers and divide, like mathematically. The math is not the hard part, right? If I just gave you like 5 numbers, it was like multiply these two and then divide these two, like you would be able to do it no problem. But it's the conceptual understanding that's the difficult part. That was on quiz 2. It was on exam 1. It was on quiz 3. It has not been over 40% correct yet. So that quiz 2 was back in week 3. So in the last, we've seen that problem. It was on the online version of the exam and it was on the in-person version of the exam. So we've seen that problem 1, 2, 3. We've seen that problem 4 different times over the last 3 weeks, and it's still below 40% correct in the class, which tells me people aren't doing this part. People are getting a bad grade and they're being like, I never want to think about that again. On to the next thing. And it's like, well, it's still the same stuff, right? We need to have that time where we look at our exams, we look at our quizzes, we look at our homeworks. And this is part of why I say don't erase things, take clear notes. When you're doing your quizzes, when you're doing exams, you want to have your work written out, not for me to see, for you to see. How easy is it for you to remember what you did on quiz 2? Do you even remember what was on quiz 2? Like, that was a while ago, right? If we don't have stuff written down, just depending on our memory to be like, oh yeah, quiz 2, I took that on a Wednesday. Of course it was on a Wednesday, but that's all I can remember about it right now. I don't even remember what date it was. But if we don't have things written down for us to go back and look at and be like, what did I do wrong? Why did I do it wrong? How can I do it right? We just keep making those same mistakes. And I haven't said this explicitly, but this is why, like, part of the whole, like, anytime there's a question that's less than 50% correct, I just put it again on the next quiz. That's part of why quiz 3 was like a hodgepodge of all the problems that people have been getting wrong all quarter. And the thing that's interesting about it is I record my office hours. I've done a lot of those problems on like recorded office hours that people could go watch on YouTube. It's posted on the top of the LabPow pages. And so like the number of photons problem, it's like on 3 different office hour videos that I've made this quarter. And I make these things. I think it's kind of interesting. I hope it's useful. I have 100 students this quarter, and like my office hour videos usually have like 10 views. Which doesn't mean 10 people watched it. It might be one person watching it 10 times, but like it's this resource that people aren't using. Where it's like people say, oh, I can't make it to your office hours, and I'm like, it's recorded. They're like, okay, great. They still don't look at it. And it's like, the problems that you're having trouble with, and we're going to get to solving these types of problems soon, but these problems that you're having trouble with, other people are having trouble with too. They come in, they ask about it, and I say, hey, you're not the only one having trouble with it. Let me record this so everyone can watch this if they couldn't make it to office hours. And people aren't using that, right? They're not being reflective. They're not looking at their problems that they got wrong and being like, why did I get this wrong? Was it a silly little mistake? Someone got a problem wrong on quiz 3. We looked at it earlier today, and it was that they forgot to convert their micromolarity to molarity. It was a silly little mistake. They're off by a factor of 1 million. But, you know, there's also bigger mistakes where it's like, oh, I actually had no idea how to start that problem. I didn't understand the key terms in the problem. I couldn't do the remember step. So when I run into a problem that's actually asking me to do understand and analyze, like I can't even begin because I can't do the remember step. So finding a balance between how we study those different things. Always looking for hints in the problems. The last thing I'll say, do you have a study group?
Well, kind of, like we said.
Study group, study group, study group, study group, study group, study group. Get a study group. You can all make a study group. Your study group, you want to have a combination of people who are at your same skill level and a couple people who are above your skill level. A couple people below your skill level, like, you know, you want to have a range of skill levels. If you are studying, like, if you're like, hey, I want to get a C so I can get through this class. If you're studying with other people who are getting C's and D's, like, it's not going to really pull your grade up. You want to be studying with people that are in the C plus B range. So that way, when you're stuck, they can help explain things to you. You can actually be like, hey, let me try explaining this thing to you. And that's like one of the big things with the writing assignments we've been doing is, are you able to explain something to somebody else? Are you able to say, like, put it into words, write it down? Can you explain something to somebody else? And if you're explaining it to somebody who doesn't know it as well, not as helpful as explaining to somebody who can be like, oh yeah, that sounds right, that makes sense to me. So finding those types of study groups where you can like help each other. One of the most valuable things I think you can do in a study group is this little activity I call quiz and pass. And this is really, okay, I'm going to use a fancy term for this. This is a very metacognitive activity. Metacognition is thinking about how you think about things. So the idea is you all could probably guess, if you sat down with a group of 4 people in the class, you could probably look at the things we did in the last week, the last few weeks. You could probably guess what's going to be on the quiz that's tomorrow. Right? You can probably guess what's going to be on the next midterm. You probably could have guessed what was going to be on the last midterm. If you sit down and think about what we did in class, you can be like, oh yeah, what's going to be on the next quiz? Let's see if we can guess. Isomers, yeah, there's probably going to be an isomers question. What else?
Charges, like the formal charge thing.
Some formal charge thing might be on there. What else?
Covalent bonding.
There's something about covalent bonding, right? We already know what's going to be on the quiz, right? We have an idea. We can probably guess. If you go through the homeworks 4.1, 4.2, you can probably figure out like, oh, that's a good question. That'll probably be on there. So the quiz pass thing is kind of doing that, but in a broader sense. So step 1 is make a quiz. So each person in your study group is going to do this. You want to have at least you and 2 other people in the study group. Too many people and it gets to be too much, but you know, a study group of like 3 to 5 is usually a good size. You're going to have it be a 4-question quiz. There's going to be 1 that's easy, 2 that are medium, and 1 that's hard. In terms of the question difficulty, you don't need to make these questions up. You can get these from the textbook. You can get them from lecture slides. You can get them from the mastery questions, quizzes, exams. You can even get them on the internet, right? You don't need to make up the questions yourself, but you want to kind of have this thing. And this is having us do 2 metacognitive things, right? You have to think, what's important in the class? And you have to think, what's easy to me? What's medium difficult to me? And what's hard to me? What's so difficult that I might not even know how to do it? Because one of the problems we have when we study alone is if my capability is here, when I'm studying and I'm looking at problems that I'm going to spend time on, I usually only pick a bracket of questions that are around my skill level. Some that are a little bit above my skill level, some a little bit below my skill level, but I never do the ones that are way up here. The ones that have like a lot of words and when I read it, it doesn't make sense to me. Like, why would I do that problem? I can't do it. But if you're not trying to do those problems, you never advance your skill level. You always stay in the same skill level. And so if your skill level right now is on the lower half of the class's distribution, If you don't change something and start challenging yourself, start aiming at those hard questions, you stay down there. You stay in that range. So you don't have to know how to do these problems. You just need to find them. Then, step 2, now, the nice thing about this is you don't actually have to meet with everybody. You can do this virtually. You can make your quiz, take a photo of it, and then send it to your friends that you're studying with, and they can send you their photos. But the idea is you're going to make your quiz, and then they're going to make their quizzes. Let's say you got a study group of 3 people. You're going to get handed 2 quizzes. And in step 3, right? And then you're going to take it like an exam. You want to practice. No notes, timer. You don't look at it until you start. So you have to go through that whole problem-solving process of you have to read the question, analyze the question, come up with an approach, and then do the approach. Right? You have to do all of those things without first thinking about the question. You just see it right away. So, and then of course, just like we saw with the assessments we have in class, then you want to have a reflective time. Right? The nice thing about this is you have to think about what's easy and hard for you, and you have to think about what's important in the class. Then you get to see what's easy and hard for the people you're studying with and what they think is important in the class. So you get to kind of have this outside perspective of like, oh, my hard question is one of their medium questions. My idea of what's difficult in this class is like too low. I need to up my idea of, I need to get past what's hard for me and get to these harder questions. And oh, what I thought was important, they have different important things that I forgot about. And this is part of why when we do these writing assignments, I have it where it's like do it alone and then do it together. It's not so you can sit there like, oh, the number of the writing assignments where there's like literally like 4, like I give you 10 minutes to write by yourself and it's open note. And there's a lot of people who write like 4 or 5 words. Like on the bonding one, there were several people who just wrote the names of the 3 bonding types. That was all they wrote. And we're just like, woo. There are people, maybe it's some of you, I don't think it's any of you because you're here talking to me, but there are people who just sit and wait for 10 minutes to see what other people put. And then they don't even write down what the other people put. The person who's like the smart one in the cluster, they're just like, oh, here, you do it. And so they take that 20 minutes that's supposed to be this really nice, like reflective, like, oh, what did you think of? What did I miss? They take that 20 minutes of reflective time in class and they just throw it away. They don't do that part. And it's a really important step in the learning process to be like, oh, because, like, what is it I want to say? Knowing things isn't where learning happens. Remembering things is where learning happens. And getting faster at remembering things and getting better at remembering things is how we know we've learned something. Like, so it's that point where you're like, oh, I totally forgot about that and I just remembered. That's where learning really happens. So if you already knew all of chemistry, you already remembered everything, like you'd be fine in the class, you wouldn't need to take a chemistry class, you'd test out of it, you'd move on. But it's that when you remember things, so taking that time to look at what other people put and being like, ah, didn't put that part, thanks for reminding me about that part. That's an important learning step. And there are a lot of people in the class who aren't doing this reflective part. They're definitely not doing it with the quizzes and the homework. They're not even doing it when it's explicitly what I'm asking them to do during class. And so just be honest with yourself, like, have you been doing that? Is it something that you can try? Again, these are things that worked for me. It's worked for students of mine in the past. It might not work. It might not work the best for you, but that's another thing to be reflective about. It's like, did it work for me? Is there a way I can change this? Is there something else I can do? So those are my top things. Questions before I stop this recording and we go on to actually solving problems. Was that good? Gives you some stuff to think about, some change in the framework of how you're thinking about the class? Okay, great. I'm going to go ahead and